that arrived would drop Gail Portman off in a back street in North London and make it look like a robbery. Ian Hopestein, who disappeared that night, would not be found until some 20 years later. But these are the stories of another legend. 5 years later. July 26, Chauvin, Louisiana, USA. Wizards and Knights. Martin Albert was a big boy now. He was almost 8. At least, he would be in a few months. His hair was a golden hue, coming down to his ears. He had inherited his dark green eyes from his father and his cute little nose from his mother. The oval-faced boy used the bucket lid as a shield in one hand, and in the other hand he held a sword his grandfather had made to prevent Theodore Watson from passing through the passage behind him. Theodore Watson was only 6 months younger than Martin. His narrow shoulders made his short dark brown head look larger than it was. The anger in his blue eyes made him attack Martin with an old brush stick, but he could not get past him. Martin laughed at the attempt, saying, "Don't bother, Sir Lancelot, there is no getting past me." An old red tablecloth was tied around his neck. The cloth fell down to his back and reached the middle of his legs. On the back of this elaborate cloak was a white bird. At this, Lisa Pollock, who was behind Theodore, took out a cloak made from the same tablecloth, threw a pinch of flour at Martin and said, "Lightning spell." He shouted, and Martin fell to his side, as if struck. Thus was the passage to the castle, which he had so bravely defended. Theodore looked at Lisa, who had come after him. The girl, whose curly orange hair was tied in 2 buns and whose face was covered with freckles, smiled with her missing teeth. "Wizards always win," she said, and passed through an opening in the wooden wall around an old house. The old wooden house was 3 stories high. From the small window on the top floor, 6-year-old Fanny Garney stuck her head out and said, "Sir Lancelot, Lady Matlees, please help me. I am trapped inside the castle." She could barely see it from the plum trees next to the house. When Theodore and Lisa headed towards the entrance, the sun came out from the clouds and illuminated the Louisiana region with its warm light. Entering the old house with graffitied walls, Theodore and Lisa fell into James, Jack and Marie's trap at the entrance of the house. Marie held her wand made from her broomstick forward and threw the raisins in her other hand to Theodore and Lisa and said, "Meteor strike." Her long black hair had been braided in a fishtail style by her mother in the morning. She wore red-framed glasses because her big brown hair was slightly slanted. When Theodore was hit by the raisins and should have fallen in pain, Marie laughed but got angry but did not dwell on the issue. In the meantime, before James and Jack, who were attacking Lisa, could reach the sorceress Lady Matlees, Martin Albert made a grand entrance and stood in front of James and Jack. "The young knight, you saved Princess Fanny, Lady Matlees. I'll hold them off." The old house had long been abandoned. Young people had used it for house parties for a long time, and then the homeless had moved in until the city closed off the side of the house with a wooden dam. Now the empty house was a mysterious playground for the little children of the neighborhood who could fit through the small gap in the wooden dam. When Lisa, the Witch of Witches, reached the stairs, she heard Fanny's voice from the top floor, "James, Jack, Lisa, Theo, Marie. Come up. I've found something." The attic was dim and warm. Jake Whiteful was the 3rd son of an African mother and a Canadian father. A half-breed, as Gerard Barton, a 6th grader at school, had said. The boy whistled as the floor creaked under his thin body, muttering, as mysterious as the forest of dangers. Daylight filtered into the attic in golden wisps through the worn cracks in the old attic. Fanny's voice could be heard through the bars of the lights. "Come this way," Princess Fanny said to Jack. "Look what I found." "What did you find?" Jack asked curiously. "The treasure chest," said Fanny in her thin voice. Her blonde hair fell in thin curls over her shoulders, and her braces gleamed silvery in the sunlight. The knights and wizards gathered around the princess and looked at the treasure chest. "What did you find in the treasure chest, Jake?" the woman asked in a soft, compassionate voice. Her dark brown hair was pulled back tightly into a bun at the back of her head. She was wearing a black suit. On the collar of her suit was an FBI ID card and a small white plastic warning device. The device was still gray. Once it was black, they would have to leave immediately. There was a thick, transparent plastic curtain between the child and the woman. Her ID card read Special Agent Diana Carter. The blue-eyed woman's arched eyebrows were quirked with concern. Jack had his eyes closed, his cute little face covered in bruises. His lips were chapped and cracked in places. The boy's eyes were slowly opening, his pupils a pale gray. "I can't see," Jake whimpered in a stinky voice. Diana swallowed hard. "I know, Jack," she said, looking at the doctor in the intensive care unit. The specialist in the plastic NKB suit shook his head from behind his mask. They were too late to treat the boy. Jack raised his hand, and his hand was covered in wounds. It was as if the child was being burned to pieces. Diana wanted to hold the child's hand, but she couldn't. Her mother sobbed behind her, and Jake said in a tired voice, "Mom?" Diana looked at the man standing next to her. The gray-haired man was in his late 40s. He was quite fit for his age. The broad-shouldered man was tall and muscular. He wore a plain brown suit. Behind him was his Army Intelligence Division ID card. It simply said Duncan McEwen. When Duncan nodded slightly, Diana smiled and whispered to the child, "Yes, my love." Her mother in the back glared at him angrily, but remained silent. "My left hand hurts so much, Mom," the boy muttered. Diana tried not to look at the boy's left hand. His left hand, covered in bandages, had been cut off this morning, but the operation had been useless. The decay would continue. Still, when the doctor nodded to the nurse in the NKB uniform next to him, the woman reached out to increase the dosage on the morphine box with a spreadsheet. But Duncan stopped her and shook his head. The nurse glared at Duncan and then glared at the doctor. But the agent was determined. When the doctor helplessly signaled for the nurse to stop, the young woman took a step back, clenching her fists in anger. Diana leaned over to the boy's ear and said, "Jack, you have to tell me what happened. We don't have much time." "We went to the castle," Jack muttered, swallowing warily. "The castle?" Diana asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's rewound," Duncan whispered, mouthing exaggeratedly as he pointed at her. Diana sighed and shook her head. They would have to hear the story again. Jack swallowed dryly and said, "Yes, it was surrounded by high walls. It was like a castle. Sir Arthur held the door, but Sir Lancelot and his wizard got past him. We fought bravely in the ballroom inside the castle. We knights fought with wizards." "Wizards?" "Yeah, you know, doing magic and stuff. Like Lady Matlees. She was in charge of the wizards. They were protecting the princess." "Where was the princess?" "In the tower, of course. I'm so thirsty. It's so hot." The boy mumbled, not even hearing Diana anymore. "The princess called us in the middle of the battle. When we got to the tower, the princess gave us the treasure chest." "What did you have in the treasure chest, Jack?" Diana asked, her eyes narrowing. When she looked at Duncan, she saw the blue-eyed man's almond-shaped eyes narrow. The man's full attention was on Jake. Jack swallowed hard. There were 2 knight swords, green. Then a monster mask, invisibility pills, military uniforms, knight armor, a cloth map. A treasure map. The boy coughed weakly, blood appearing on his lips. The doctor looked at the boy and the agents, shaking his head as Jack continued to speak. James knew the island on the map. "We got Sir Michael's ship," he said while another FBI agent behind this small group said, "Michael Jenny is waiting for a plane in Toronto right now," referring to the child psychologist. She was a young woman. She spoke with a rather unemotional tone that contrasted with the situation. Diana thought the young agent named Eleanor Dave was wearing a mask. Eleanor was a new agent in the group, and this was her first field experience. Diana couldn't help but think, if she doesn't quit her job because of this incident, she never will, and she asked the young agent, "What about the ship?" "The neighbors said he had a canoe," the agent replied without hesitation. Jack swallowed hard and raised his hand. We went to the treasure island by ship. We looked everywhere. We finally found it, the Great Dragon's Cave. We each took an invisibility pill in case we encountered the dragon in the cave. There was a silver chest at the end of the cave. It was so heavy, we couldn't lift it. It had strange writings on it. We tried hard, but we finally slid the lid open. Diana turned her attention back to Jake. "What did you get in it?" she asked. The boy smiled tiredly. There were exactly 6. 6 wizard orbs in the chest. We shared the orbs and returned home. He said tiredly, "I was going to give it to you, Mother. For your birthday." These were the last words Jack Whitehall said just before he died from the high radiation. Agent Carter, who had barely made it to the rooftop just above the intensive care unit of St. John's Hospital, which had been evacuated for emergency purposes, pulled out a pack of cigarettes from inside her jacket with trembling hands. Her hands were shaking so much that she couldn't help but curse when she dropped the first 2. She couldn't find the lighter she needed to light her cigarette, which she finally managed to put between her thin lips. Suddenly a lighter appeared right in front of her. Duncan lit Agent Carter's cigarette, then lit his own, and inhaled the smoke with great need. She could see almost the entire town from the rooftop. She looked at the trees that covered part of the town and the forest beyond, and asked, "Do you have children, Agent Carter?" Carter shook his head. "I only have one sister. Elizabeth, who is also an agent with the FBI. It doesn't take a child to upset someone." Duncan nodded. "You're right. But the Pentagon has ordered me to make sure we can work together on this. I need to make sure you remember the kid's face when we get to the end and don't blow any unnecessary holes in anyone's head." "Maybe we should just put 2 holes in their heads," Diana said, looking at Duncan. She noticed the redness on Duncan's left cheek. "Nurse," Duncan McEwen explained, putting his hand to his cheek. "He was just mad about the morphine thing. It's not about how many holes you put in their heads, Agent. I think we should kill everyone involved, their neighbors, their entire neighborhood. But first we need to find out who they're working with. Jake Whitehall, Lisa, James, Fanny, and their families are dead. Because the kids took hardened plutonium spheres home. The people who answered the 911 call and came to their rescue will probably be dead this week. The entire sheriff's department and the ambulance crew. They're going to be dead too, because someone managed to smuggle nuclear warheads into U.S. territory. If those kids hadn't found those pieces and sacrificed themselves, millions of Americans would have died. Now it's our job to find the sons of bitches who killed those kids." Diana dropped her cigarette onto the gravel floor and sighed. "How do we find them?" "Can I trust you, Agent Carter?" Martin asked. Diana just nodded. "Yes, you can trust me, Agent McEwen," she grumbled. "Duncan will do," Duncan said with a smile. Diana smiled and said, "Diana, that's enough." Martin smiled and said, "Okay then, partner. Let's go down to the cafeteria, have a cup of coffee, and find someone to snoop around in the victims' homes. I don't know about you, but there's no way I'm getting into those clothes in this heat." July 26, New York, USA. Foundation. The Ferguson Foundation was located on the edge of the city limits in the northeastern corner of New York. The foundation students were mostly orphans. Rarely were people with families accepted. The foundation took in young people who were boarders or had no families, and it provided an elite education that could only be provided by very select schools. Henry Gerard, a tall, overweight young man, was leaning against the pine tree that rustled in the wind, listening to the harmony of a flute somewhere in the distance, probably played by Lucy Davian. It was one of those moments to be savored. Gerard, who allowed the sun to warm him gently, glanced sideways at the school bus leaving. A voice from just across the street asked him, "Aren't you going to the city?" Gerard knew the owner of the voice. With an expression close to a smile, he turned the page of the book he was reading and muttered, "I have something else to do today." The young man who owned the voice came up to Gerard and glanced at what he was reading, and said gruffly, "Did you refuse to go to the city to study Goethe?" His name was Benedict Free, and he was dark-skinned and blue-eyed like Gerard. He was a hand's width taller than Gerard, broad-shouldered, and quite athletic. Benedict Free was 18 and would be leaving the Foundation at the end of the year. The muscular man who was the Foundation's sports star got along best with at the Foundation was, strangely enough, Henry Gerard, whose personality was completely opposite to each other. The main reason for this was that Henry, who was now 16, had come to the Foundation when he was 2 years old, and Benedict had taken him in like a brother. Of course, this brotherly bond was mutual. Henry, too, saw this big, spoiled, and bully young man, who had no blood ties, as his older brother. He was a bit of a jerk, easily angered, but he was still his older brother. 3 years ago, Benedict had taken the Foundation's selection exam, and after that, he had gone to the Teproc campus further north. There was a dress code on this campus. They were wearing a black clerical collar jacket, black fabric trousers and black shoes that reminded Gerard of Catholic priests. Henry shook his head slightly from side to side and said to Benedict, "Goda is just keeping me busy while I wait." Then, as usual, he adjusted his thick-framed glasses behind which his blue eyes disappeared, with his finger and continued reading the book in his hand. Henry Gerard was one of the Foundation teacher's favorite students. He was very talented in languages. He could speak German, Italian, Russian, Greek, Latin and Arabic fluently and read them easily. As always, he was wearing brown fabric trousers and a sandy-colored shirt. "Why didn't you go to town with the girls?" he asked with an amused expression. Benedict had changed a lot since he went to Earth campus. He spoke less. It was as if he had drawn an invisible shield around himself. He was more serious now. The arrogant behavior he used to carry had washed off him like a rain. He would come from the campus a few days a month, spend time with Henry and his friends who had chosen to stay here during the selection exam, and then return. Benedict shrugged and muttered, "I have to practice. The scouts from Yale are coming next week. My grades won't get me a scholarship." It was the kind of statement Benedict would never make to anyone else at the Foundation, but Henry didn't believe it for some reason. Henry thought there was something wrong with Benedict's voice. Before he went to the Earth campus, his brother would always have a cheerful twinkle in his eye when he talked about the college or athletic scholarship he had so passionately wanted. But now he was just talking about it as if it were an unnecessary detail. His broad face and the curved nose under his thick eyebrows made him look like a hawk for a brief moment. Henry laughed at his expression and said, "Don't worry, no one wants to run into you on the football field," as a white luxury vehicle began to approach the road the school bus was winding down. Henry closed his book and said quickly, "I have to go." Benedict looked at Henry first, then at the approaching car, and followed him with questioning eyes. Henry hurriedly walked under a tree from where he could see the Foundation entrance, then put his fingers in his mouth and whistled 1 long and 3 short whistles. At this, there was movement in an open window on the east wing of the magnificent building. Lucy Davian, who was sitting on the long windowsill on the 2nd floor of the 4-story building, put down the flute in her hand and picked up her mobile phone. As Henry and I had agreed before, she started to act as if they were texting, but the lens of the phone had a large lens attached. At that moment, a white Bentley car had arrived at the Foundation entrance. The driver, who got out of the car, looked around carefully as he opened the passenger door. When a man in a white suit and a Panama hat got out of the passenger door, Lucy took photos of the man with her mobile phone and immediately sent them to Henry, deleting them from her phone. Although there was no need for such precautions. Neither the man in the Panama hat carrying a baby in his arms nor the bodyguard who was his driver and carrying the baby's belongings paid attention to the young girl 2 feet up and 30 meters away. Henry smiled as the message on his mobile phone vibrated and greeted Lucy by raising his hand to his eyebrow. The young girl, whose golden hair shone like a jewel in the sunlight, waved at Henry with the joy in her blue eyes and continued to play the flute. Henry sighed and put his hands in his pockets, put his book under his arm, and started walking towards the main building of the Foundation. The sun had made him very hot. It would be good to spend some time in the shady and cool library. By the time the sun had set behind the hills, everyone had already eaten and returned to their final activities until bedtime at 11. A few of them were gathered in the activity room in the large library. All the students gathered were, as previously understood, over the age of 14. These youngsters, who were readers of fantasy fiction, were members of the role-playing games club. Kate Hall was running the game. The tall, athletic young girl was 15. Kate was one of the most remarkable students at the Foundation. She had come to the Foundation when she was 12 and had worked very hard to close the gap in education between her and the other Foundation students. Her dark brown hair was only 4 fingers long. Her blue eyes were so dark they were almost navy blue. The girl had a sharp face, a small nose, and her full, small lips were drawn into a tight line. Anton watched the young girl with pleasure. The tall girl was athletic and had sexy curves. Anton found her always careful and reserved. Kate was also a warrior. When she came to the Foundation, the girl had learned Shaolin Kung Fu, Kendo, Iaido, and archery as well as her classes. Anton knew it was because of her past. He had researched her online and found out that her family had been killed by a street gang. Still, he wanted her. Anton Leshrak, who sighed and shook his head, was also 15 years old. He had been at the Foundation since he was 6. He was sitting at the round oak table in the activity room, as usual, between his best friend Henry Gerard and James Brown. He had tied up his black hair that fell over his shoulders. His dark brown eyes were gleefully scanning the other friends who were participating in the game. James Brown was discussing game tactics with his brother Jonas. Benedict had not participated in this game, he was still training in the gym. Lucy and Julia were choosing new clothes for their characters. Eric Sladen, who looked at them and smiled with a relaxed attitude, looked quite reckless. The young man with red hair and blue eyes, thin and tall, seemed so relaxed and careless, but he had already prepared his character and game plan. Anton's eyes were once again fixed on Kate. He had never been able to tell the beautiful girl how he felt. He had never been able to stand a chance anyway. She had never been handsome, attractive or remarkable. Even Kate had only been able to say his name without him reminding her in the 4th game. Only when the game started, when he started acting as usual, did the young man turn his attention from Kate to Henry. Henry was so out of his normal playing style. He was withdrawn and on a different planet. Henry was barely involved in the game, just standing in the background doing things he normally wouldn't do. Anton tried to escape a fight Lucy and Julia started at the most intense point of the game, but he put the conversation with Henry to one side of his mind. Kate's roommate, Lucy Davian, was also 15. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl was a little shorter than Henry and more athletic. She had 2 deep, diagonal cuts on the left side of her beautiful face. This scar was a legacy of a car accident Lucy had with her family when she was 9. Her family had been wiped out in that accident, and that was how she had come to the Foundation. Lucy, who was so beautiful that everyone would turn and look at her twice or 3 times if it weren't for this scar, didn't go on New York trips unless she had to because of this scar. She knew Italian, German, Greek, Russian, and Spanish, which was the standard education the Foundation held. She played fencing and volleyball. Her greatest desire in life was to travel the world. She only used role-playing games to make the most of her free Wednesday nights. That's why her recklessness rivaled Eric's. When the fight in the game was over, Kate looked at her watch and told the group that they had finished the game for tonight and would continue the scenario tomorrow night. As the players gathered the books and notepapers on the table and headed to their rooms, Anton bit his lip and reached out to touch Kate's shoulder. He was going to thank her for the game. But before he could reach out, he saw Henry. His hand changed direction and landed on the shoulder of the short-haired, bespectacled man. Winking at Henry, who looked at him curiously, Anton asked, "Is everything okay?" Normally Henry would have answered these questions with, "Great, amazing, the bombshell." Now he looked around, shrugged, and said, "Can we talk later?" and walked away. Anton sighed, surprised, as he looked after Henry and then Kate with raised eyebrows. At 5:30 in the morning, Anton, who had turned off his alarm clock before it had even made its second long beep, slid out of his bunk like a ghost. He didn't want to wake Eric, who was still snoring. As usual, he He put on a 1 kilo weight on his ankles and a ½ kilo weight on his arms, put on his sports clothes and went for a run. He had to get down to the riverbed east of the foundation building before sunrise. Few people knew that he had walked 6 kilometers along the riverbed and returned 6 kilometers. Anton left the wing where the student rooms were and entered the path leading to the riverbed. As usual, he increased his speed when he was out of sight of the school. When he reached the riverbed, he slowed down and stopped in an unusual way. He walked towards Henry Gerard, who was waiting for him under the willow tree at the side of the road. Nodding to him, Henry adjusted his glasses and asked, "Anton, do you remember how you got to the foundation?" "I came the same way everyone else did," Anton said, squinting his eyes. "Thanks to the insurance." "Do you remember?" Henry asked with a sigh. Anton looked around and asked, "I was 6 years old, Henry. Most of what I remember is either very vague or biased." "Why?" It was strange that Henry should ask these questions, and even stranger that he should ask them at this hour and here. "I think there's a catch," said Henry, without beating around the bush. "Like what?" Anton asked, looking at her curiously. Henry said thoughtfully, "I don't think just having insurance got us here. I don't know what the whole story is, but it doesn't add up." Anton sighed and put his hands on Henry's shoulders. "My friend, I only trust the education I received here, my brothers, the laws of physics, and your mind. I know you, Henry. If you're telling me these things here, it means you want something from me." "We'll play spy," Henry said, nodding, his previous shadow-sculling self gone. Anton swallowed and nodded. "I understand, but if you're right, we're not going to like what we find." "I know, but we might not like what happens to us if we don't find out before it's too late," Henry said, shaking his head. "Why so late?" Anton asked curiously. Henry shrugged. "I'm not sure, Anton. That's the real problem." July 27th, Chauvin, Louisiana, USA. Dragon's Mouth. The smell of rotting trees seemed to grow more sinister with the humidity that hung in the air. The broad-leaved trees stretched toward the sky, blocking out sunlight like an umbrella, darkening the area to a pitch black. A few wisps of fragile sunlight, freed from the sickly undergrowth of the tree leaves, reached the forest floor. But these were so rare that these wisps of light, swept away by the wind, were like ghosts in the shadowy forest. While Duncan turned back and looked at the rooftops of the houses visible through the trees a short distance away, Carter's attention was fixated on the tiny footprints on the ground. 4 agents from the FBI's tactical team were checking to see if the area around them was safe. The swampy island was right next to the town. The area had been underwater for a long time after Hurricane Marianne, which had struck about a decade earlier. When one of the agents, carrying an M4, waved Carter over, the woman looked at Duncan and said, "The island is clear." Duncan was wearing the classic Ray-Ban aviator sunglasses that had made the brand famous. The agent had a cigarette between his lips, hands in his pockets, and a relaxed air of amusement as he looked around. He gestured to Agent Carter with a polite expression that she could go first. His tone suggested that he was oddly amused by the situation. In the morning, the Army personnel under the command of the search team had searched the houses of the dead families. All the victims had clothes that had either been freshly washed or were covered in mud. The color of the mud matched that of the swamp, especially on this island. There was enough radioactive fallout on the clothes that they had to be secured immediately. The fallout was so heavy that Duncan could hear the Geiger buzzing outside the house. Finally, they found the clue they were looking for among Fanny's belongings. It was a map of the area, printed on a silk cloth with a printing press. One of the children must have recognized the marked map and led them here. While Duncan was thinking these things, Carter warned him and pointed to the tree ahead. The roots of the tree, exposed by erosion and periodic high water, looked like a dragon. The footprints of the children who had advanced towards the mouth of the dragon and back were still clearly visible. Without taking his hands out of his pockets, Duncan said, "Brave boys, I wouldn't go in there even with a gun." Agent Diana Carter laughed wryly at this, pulling a bottle of pills from her pocket and tossing them to Duncan. But you do have invisibility pills, she said. Duncan examined the box in the evidence bag. The bottle of pills he'd found in one of the victims' homes was labeled potassium iodide. Potassium iodide was used as a limited protection against radioactive fallout. Meanwhile, the Army specialists called by the tactical team had arrived on the island in a Zodiac boat wearing NKB uniforms. Duncan found himself shivering and thinking about the durability it would take to be in that thick plastic suit in the hot weather. The men, who put on their masks and checked their teammates, crawled into the cave and came out a few minutes later. Behind them was a box the size of a small ice box. It was obvious that the box was lead because it was buried in the damp soil. Duncan thought the box weighed more than 40 kilos from the movements of the men. The special team specialist in the NKB suit turned the yellow plastic-covered Geiger counter in his hand to the box. When the counter made a loud hissing sound, the man looked at the display and whistled. When the specialist turned to the agents and closed the lid of the box, the Geiger device calmed down like a dog with an itch behind its ear. Only then could Duncan, who was able to approach the box without his protective clothing, sighed at the writings on the box and the red hammer and sickle symbols. Diana Carter, who was next to him, crouched down and looked at the box closely. Russians? It must have been brought in after the collapse of the USSR. There was a lot of chaos back then. The Russians don't even want to talk about what went missing from their abandoned or looted military bases, Duncan grumbled, lighting the cigarette between his lips. Despite the warm, clear air, there was so much humidity that the cigarette smoke practically hung in the air like an ominous cloud. Meanwhile, Diana Carter looked at her ringing cell phone. Smiling half-heartedly at the incoming message, she said, "The message is from Eleanor. That little one, who didn't join the group that day. She told our psychologist where they were playing, showing the message on her phone." "Well, we're off to a start." "I love a start," Duncan said, taking one last disapproving look at the lead box, and started toward the six-slung swamp boat belonging to the sheriff's department. It was late afternoon when the two FBI SUVs pulled up at the address they had been given. Leroy Barleen was 7 years old. He lived on the same street as the other victims. He had played with them all summer, except for the incident that had killed the victims. That day, Leroy had gone downtown to watch his older brother Will's basketball tryouts. So the surviving family had allowed Leroy to be interviewed by a psychologist. Now, as they had been advised, they were leaving their home for a while. The location described was at the end of the street where the victims had lived. The abandoned house was surrounded by a 7-foot-high wooden wall built by the city. The wooden wall was covered with advertising and announcement posters. "The castle," Duncan muttered at the sight. The light that seeped through the gaps in the dim house formed columns. The pigeons that flew restlessly at those who entered had raised a bit of dust along with them. The house looked more ransacked than abandoned. Everything that could be used had been taken, and everything that could not be carried had been broken into pieces. Duncan could see the child's footprints on the wooden stairs that creaked under their own weight. A flight later, he found a wooden sword leaning against the banister. The knight who owned the sword would never come back. Duncan looked at Diana, who was advancing in front of him, and shook his head slightly. Maybe she was right. At least he could kill these scum by the roadside after he had made them talk. Duncan sighed and looked at the sword again. The attic was low, hot, and stuffy. Leroy had never been up here before, so the agents assumed this was the Prince's Tower. Duncan glanced around and noticed the open ammunition box. Inside the old military box he had come to were the other treasures Jack had mentioned. The two green swords were the standard bayonets for the HK-G3 rifle. The monster mask was the mask of the NKB suit Mark IV, folded under the box, and next to it was another pillbox. Potassium iodide? Diana asked Duncan, who had picked up the box. Yes, Duncan said, nodding, then smiling, taking one last look at the box and tossing the pill box to Diana. Invisibility pills, he muttered. Well, you have the plutonium spheres. Even without them, you have a map showing where they are. That map is worth several $1 billion on the black market. Why would you leave them at home? Diana asked, as she held the box up and down in her hands as if weighing it. Duncan pursed his lips and began searching for his cigarette case, then straightened up and said, "Maybe he left it at home," then narrowed his eyes and asked, "Whose house is it?" Diana sighed and pulled her cell phone out of her jacket. "I don't know, probably dead. The sheriff and most of the department are in the hospital right now, so we can find out." "That's great, we'll do it the old-fashioned way then," Duncan said with a smile. "What are we doing?" Diana asked as she texted the agents on the investigation team. "We'll ask the city," Duncan said, snorting with a cigarette between his lips. Duncan McEwen was a classic police detective in many ways. Diana couldn't help but wonder what his story was. The sheriff's department had been overrun by the FBI. The FBI had sent in a tactical team and 16 agents for the job. Duncan sat on the old couch in the sheriff's office, talking to the deputy mayor on his cell phone. Deputy Mayor Fred Bulland, anxiously, even a little panicked, repeated Duncan's address. 117 Bennett Street, he said after a pause. "James Taylor," he said with the same fervor as if he had just finished a major historical study. "James Henry Taylor," Diana said, entering the social services number Bulland had given her into her laptop. Born in New York in 1988. Joined the military in 2008, she began reading the data in front of her. The woman was sitting at the desk of the elderly sheriff who had just been reported dead. The incident had been questioned by news outlets downtown a few hours ago, and the FBI had been forced to send a statement to all local and national news outlets in the area. The statement stated that the current case was a matter of national security and that there was a broadcast ban on the case until further notice. Thanking the vice president, Duncan hung up and asked, "And then?" Diana punched a few keys on the computer and said, "He went missing in 2012. Duncan grunted and asked, "What about taxes?" Diana looked at him curiously and repeated, "Tax?" in a questioning tone. Duncan shrugged. "You can't escape taxes and death. Unless someone has repossessed the house yet, the taxes are paid. And that has to be done legally." Diana raised her eyebrows and smiled before turning back to her computer. Duncan did seem like a seasoned cop. His experience was a huge time saver for the FBI. "Automatic payment from Bullwash Bank," she said, looking at the results. "Where does the money come from?" Duncan asked. FBI investigations used a special interrogation system to track dirty money. This system did not require a court order to examine a bank account. Diana, who used the system, said, "Army salary," then paused. "I don't understand, the Army?" she asked herself. "Missing soldiers continue to be paid," Duncan said with a shrug. "A law passed just before the Great Depression requires a team of experts to determine whether a soldier has deserted." July 27, New York, USA. The tallest building in New York was next tower. The silver-colored building was almost 100 meters taller than the nearest buildings. However, Neesco Oil had recently acquired many companies with its investments. Despite its magnificent tower, it was a company that was not visible, but was a major shareholder of many oil giants. This company had many subordinate and front-working groups. Neesco was an empire, and this empire was no longer run by its founder Bakesfield, but by Edward M.C. Rollins. This was a silent revolution decided by the board of directors of Neesco Oil about 10 years ago. Bakesfield was now just a manager, and in his own empire. No one understood why he was still with the company, why he was answering to Edward like a rookie management trainee. The power of the old man, who was around 60 and had always been careful about his weight, was felt at first glance. His face, which was always serious and incomprehensible, had angular, hard lines. Behind his small eyes and prominent cheekbones, there was a rare sparkle in his peers. His white hair was combed back to the nape of his neck as usual. Most of his employees, unlike now, knew Bakesfield's affectionate and warm gaze. However, his employees knew very little about Bakesfield. Bakesfield was wearing one of his usual navy blue, hand-tailored suits. He was looking at the man sitting at his mahogany desk in the management office on the 112th floor of next tower, the headquarters of the Neesco Oil Empire, with a look of hatred that he did not hesitate to conceal. The oval-shaped room had a unique view of New York at its front. In front of the view was MC Rollins' large, classic desk. The room was covered with granite and mahogany strips. Bonsai trees, now 5 feet tall, were placed on either side of the glass. The entrance to the room was completed by 2 thick mahogany doors. The man sitting behind the desk opposite Bakesfield was Edward MC Rollins. The man, in his mid-50s, was a hand's width shorter than Bakesfield but more stocky. His broad, angular face had once been so regular that it would have made many a woman sigh. His hair was cut short in an officer's style. His broad, powerful hands were strong, as if they belonged more to a longshoreman than to a corporate executive. His eyes were dark blue, almost navy blue, as he scanned the report Bakesfield had given him. Then he asked, his tone stern. The files in front of him belonged to 2 young men, British nationals. On his right hand he held an old silver ring. On his broad face was the words, Tenebris pugnabimus usque in lucem, written long ago and almost lost. McCrollins wore a high-collared white shirt of the latest fashion and an expensive suit of shiny fabric. Sean and Ian Hopestein? No, we're not sure. But I think they should be eliminated without risk, Bakesfield said in his usual nonchalant manner and British accent, as if he were talking about simply removing an obstacle rather than killing someone. Edward McCrollins didn't seem to find Bakesfield's attitude surprising. He continued to examine the reports. It says here that one of the brothers is missing, he said calmly. I don't think the plot was lost, they just hid the kid, Bakesfield said. The file had been delivered to him 2 days ago by lower-level darkmen. Bakesfield wondered how the damn thing had ever come his way after half a dozen plots to hide it, but he knew he was in trouble. He had to get the file in front of McCrollins now, because this was either a test or a plot. Why did you come to that conclusion? Asked McCrollins, raising one eyebrow and squinting at Bakesfield. He placed the files neatly and silently in front of him and placed his hands on the table, thick fingers interlaced. Bakesfield's right hand was in his pocket, his left hand waving in a way that suited the scene for the purpose of making his statements more effective. Based on the data from before the disappearance, it is clear that the young men were the twins of destiny. They must have sent one of the twins somewhere else to hide this. We didn't realize this because just before we were separated from the twins, one of our agents there was ambushed and killed, he said, quickly and passionately explaining his theory. McCrollins understood the story immediately. He snapped his fingers and said, ah, yes, the London Sky Tower raid. But wasn't that a revenge attack? There was another agent there, what happened to that? Bakesfield continued to report, more like a colonel than a businessman. Our second agent there was Michael Richardson. He went to Central Europe and infiltrated the Serbian terrorists because Pope Octavius was assassinated on the same day. That's why we couldn't get his report on the matter. Besides, are you really going to believe in coincidences when it comes to them? He asked. McCrollins leaned back in his chair and said, of course not, but I will not allow an innocent Christian young man to be killed on a simple suspicion. He actually thought that Bakesfield had set him up. How had this file come after all this time, how had it not reached him for so long? The old fox must have been planning to have McCrollins kill 2 innocent young men and put the blame on him in order to seize his own seat. You may have him watch the remaining brother if you wish, but there will be no murder unless there is clear evidence, he said, the finality of the instruction evident in the coldness of his tone. McCrollins was not stupid, he would not fall into this simple trap. Bakesfield leaned forward slowly and saluted McCrollins. As you see fit, he said. It was not a common demeanor for corporate management. It was more likely to be seen in a military group. Bakesfield's demeanor was calm and submissive as he walked out of the room, a triumphant smile on his face. The fool had fallen into McCrollins' trap, the children would be safe, all he needed now was a few more tricks to convince them that the file was not trustworthy. As soon as he was out of the room, he dialed a number he had memorized and not in his contact list. Otto, it's James. We need to meet, he said, his voice calm but bored. 28, New York, USA. Spies. Walking with a flashlight at 3 in the morning, math teacher Thomas Phillips was in the west wing of the second floor. His footsteps echoed on the wooden floor. Phillips, the teacher who was on night duty once a month, would walk around the entire building, as he did every night. The tall, well-built man paused for a moment and looked around. The light from his flashlight illuminated the school secretary's desk, the doors to the principal's offices and restrooms, and the glass display where the awards were kept. He was in the section where the principal and vice principal were, and he was sure he had heard something. Looking around, Phillips heard nothing else, so he continued walking. The teacher, who took his duty very seriously, turned the corner and the bathroom door in the corner opened. Anton, who stuck his head out and checked the surroundings, whispered to Henry behind him, "Did you find Mr. Phillips' shift?" "There are worse things," Henry said with a smile. Grinning at Anton, who was looking at him curiously, he said, "The other teacher on duty is Jun Sung." Anton's eyes widened in horror. Sung was the teacher of the wilderness survival class. The Korean man of few words had come to the foundation 2 years ago. Anton couldn't help but swallow loudly when he thought of the slanted-eyed man. No one knew the past of the short, slanted-eyed Korean. As Anton walked towards the principal's office, he checked his surroundings and repeated in his mind that he should not forget to delete the security camera footage. Anton had not been to the principal's office for a long time. And he was glad about that. The principal's office was dark. The room was furnished in a classical style, illuminated by the light of the hand lamps, the wooden and embroidered armchairs, the table and the bookcase almost swallowed the light. "Where do we start?" Anton asked, closing the door after Henry passed him. Henry shrugged. "Should we go through our files first? If there's something weird, no one will notice it better than us." Anton located the student files and called Henry over. He and Henry started looking through them, but there was nothing strange or unusual about them. He shook his head and said, "This is stupid." Henry himself had reached the end of his file. "Stupid?" he grumbled. Anton put his own file back in its place and said, "Yeah, if these guys are hiding something, they wouldn't leave it to be found in the principal's office. I mean, law enforcement, and we would look here first. That's obvious." "You're right," Henry said, nodding, and sighed. He was probably looking for something he had little chance of finding anyway, out of his own paranoia. They were going to get into trouble sooner or later, and it was fine if he got into trouble himself, but he'd be devastated if he got Anton expelled. "Come on, delete those security camera feeds so we can run," he growled. Nodding, Anton went to the principal's desk and turned on his computer. James had given them the principal's password one day. Anton grinned as he typed in the password. "I felt like a hacker." Henry smiled and shook his head. Then he suddenly remembered something and said to Anton, "These are the dates of the files, aren't they?" He pointed to the folder names. "So what happened?" Anton asked, looking over his shoulder at Henry. Henry leaned over and pointed to the man in the white hat getting out of his car, looking at the footage from the previous day. "This is the anomaly we're looking for," he said. "Who is that?" Anton asked with a frown. "I don't know," Henry said, shrugging. "But I've seen him for 2 months now. He always comes in on the same day of the month and brings a new kid to the foundation. He always does it after the city shuttle." Anton narrowed his eyes. "Nonsense, children come to us with insurance lawyers and social services workers," he said, while Henry tapped the image on the screen with his finger. "Tell that to the baby the man is carrying." Anton looked at the date, compared it to the previous month. Sure enough, it had arrived just after the New York City shuttle had left. He had a child with him who could barely walk. He looked at the previous month, and the one before that. It was all around the same time, and the man was always accompanied by a child. Anton began skipping years instead of months. The man had barely skipped a month. Henry and Anton were both as surprised as they got to 1985. "You may say I'm not serious, but this man doesn't look like he's aged at all," Henry grumbled, looking closely at the old video footage that had been pulled up on the computer. Anton leaned back and muttered, "I see the same thing, but it's impossible. Although, after a certain age, all old people always look old to me." When Henry glared at him, he just shrugged. Henry sighed and muttered, "Come on, make us invisible already." And indeed, it had happened as Anton had said. They had learned some things, but they had not liked what they had learned. Anton, who found the camera footage, copied the previous night's camera footage as Henry had planned, changed the name, and replaced the file with that night's recording file. If they didn't realize that the crazy mathematician on patrol wasn't really on the loose, no one would be able to find them. At that moment, the room lights came on and a familiar male voice said, "What the hell are you doing here?" "Oh, Mr. Phillips," Anton said as Henry swallowed audibly. "Yes?" said the big man, the maths teacher. He expected a definitive answer from his two students. When Anton saw the man reach into his pocket, he knew he was going to call the principal. Anton, who had no other choice, swallowed quickly and said pitifully, "It's all my fault, Mr. Phillips. I have feelings for Victoria," he said, leaving the sentence unfinished, and met Henry's eyes. Henry recognized the role he was playing. He had used the type in a role-playing game they had played last year. Mr. Phillips reached into his pocket, crossed his arms over his chest, and asked, "What kind of things?" Anton swallowed and bowed his head. "I'm in love," he said. He trembled his voice, but Henry said he saw them with James. "I mean, in the library," he said, pointing to Henry, and the young man nodded, looking at the math teacher who was looking at him. He had indeed caught the two of them kissing in the library and had told Anton. But it wasn't because Anton had a crush on Victoria. Anton hadn't told anyone, but he had a crush on Kate Hall. Henry had only said this to gossip. Anton was just creating a lie using provable facts at the time. "You didn't believe him either," Thomas Phillips said then, smiling. Anton shook his head, looking at Henry with a shy look. "I didn't believe him," his gaze offering Henry a wordless apology. Thomas Phillips looked at the two young men and said, "Go to your room. You could get fired from the foundation for being so stupid." After the regretful and embarrassed children left, Thomas Phillips shook his head and checked his wristwatch. When he was sure that Anton and Henry had gone away, he hurriedly sat down on the couch and plugged a USB data carrier into the computer. He ran the program inside and started transferring the information in the computer to another location. July 28, New York, Manhattan, USA. Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island were the five main boroughs of New York City. But the heart was Manhattan. It was the commercial, cultural, and financial center of New York, and that hadn't changed even after the 2020 economic crisis. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case for Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. The protests, which started with those who were unemployed or in debt beyond their means, turned into a crisis with the harsh response of the police, and then into a riot when the military was called in, nearly devastating these three boroughs. Manhattan had survived the riots unscathed, allowing investors to accept it as a safe area and for the land to appreciate. Along with the new ones, Manhattan was home to many famous buildings, museums, universities and tourist attractions. The United Nations headquarters was also still here. Manhattan was also the area with the most business centers in the United States. The New York Stock Exchange and NASDAQ were located here. It was also the area with the most corporate entities in the country. The name Manhattan came from Manyatta. This name was first encountered in Robert Jewett's travel journal. A map from 1610 used the name Mannahatta for the second time for this area. Manhattan was translated from the Lenape language as Island of Many Hills. Manhattan was experiencing one of its usual cool mornings. The streets and the air of the city, which had been soaked in the heavy rain of the previous evening, had become noticeably cleaner. New York had suddenly become cooler. But those with rheumatism knew that the rain was coming again. It had been about 10 years since the seasons had changed their normal conditions. The first reaction of the world, which had begun to be polluted by the Industrial Revolution, was seen in the weather. The rains were now heavy and instantaneous, often causing floods or inundations. Duke Perry, who lived on the third floor of 43 Essex Street, one of Manhattan's oldest buildings, was 55 years old, and he certainly felt his age when he woke up this morning. He yawned and grunted as he rose from his bed, holding his aching head. An empty bottle of Black Label Jack Daniels fell from his bed to the floor. Duke looked around to see what had woken him, and brushed back his gray hair, which normally hung down to his neck and fell across his face. The movement revealed a deep scar on the left side of his forehead. Duke Perry had a broad, angular face. Under his thick gray eyebrows, his bloodshot, ice blue eyes narrowed and scanned the dimly lit room. The dark circles under his eyes and the countless worry lines around them made Perry look 10 years older than he was. He had gone to bed wearing the suit he'd worn to work the day before. Or had he worn this the day before? Well, what did it matter? He had finally figured out what had woken him up. The house phone, which he hadn't used in a long time, was ringing. The damn thing hadn't rang once in 6 years, and now he had decided to wake it. Perry had staggered all the way to the hallway, his aching head momentarily losing his balance and propping himself up against the wall. The hallway wall was lined with photographs and awards he'd received for his work as a journalist, a job he'd been doing since 1995. The big man was nearly 6 feet tall. With broad shoulders and thick arms, he looked like a boxer. He answered the phone with his aching head and his deep voice. Yes. He grunted. He sounded more like a black bear that had been woken from hibernation than a human being. The voice on the other end of the crackling phone connection was younger and more energetic than hers. Perry? The male speaker said in a curious tone. Who are you? Perry asked, scratching his head and leaning against the wall. It's me, Tanner, the male voice said cheerfully. This name must not have meant anything to the reporter looking at the family photo on his phone, because he repeated the name, Tanner. Meanwhile, he was looking at his daughter and wife hugging him in the photo that was at least 10 years old. How happy they were. How long had passed? The man on the other end sighed and reminded himself, Tanner Winslaw, from Iraq. Oh yes, how are you, Winslaw? Duke Perry said, his eyes narrowing as he put the photo away. Not bad, man, are you free tonight? Said the young voice on the other end. To drink or to talk? We can drink, but we need to talk first. I guess you have a good story. It's a big but, no one would believe me except you. From where? Because you know I'm not crazy, Tanner Winslaw said solemnly. To Duke, this was a serious warning sign. Then let's meet at the old place, said Duke. It was obvious that the man in front of him was speaking in an anxious and urgent manner, yet he was somehow able to cover up this anxiety. That may be the case, but as I said, I have a good story to tell and you have a newspaper to publish. It wouldn't be bad if you stayed sober while telling it, he said. Duke sneered. He hadn't been sober in nearly 7 years. Good idea, he said, then paused for a moment before asking, I'll have an intern with me. Is that a problem? What's the deal? Tanner asked, as if he didn't understand. Perry sighed. They gave me an intern, a young man who's going to learn a profession. I have to run around like my tail, and besides, I'm an old man now. I need someone to hold my coffee, he said with a smile. Tanner started laughing on the other end of the phone, and Duke sighed. The intern was going to be more trouble than he had anticipated. Sure, Tanner said, he can come too. Let's meet at the place where we first met, Tanner said, that was the second warning. Tanner wouldn't give names of places, he was afraid of being overheard. By the way, what's his name? Joanna Swanson, Duke said, he is smiling. July 28, Texas, USA. FBI convoy. The special FBI convoy crossing the Texas state border was traveling close to each other and very fast, in accordance with its own rules. The road was closed with high cliffs on both sides. The armored vehicle, protected by 6 SUVs, 3 in front and 3 in the back, was carrying the plutonium spheres found in Louisiana. Agent Jason Stonebrook, who was in the SUV behind the armored vehicle, took the menthol gum from the trunk of his Kevlar assault jacket and offered it to the agent next to him. However, the man shook his head and rejected the offer. When the others also rejected the gum, the blond, blue-eyed man shrugged and put the gum in his mouth, and asked, "Did anyone ask how these bastards got 6 nuclear weapon cores across the border? I mean, isn't the CIA, who deals with these things, interested?" This was the only question asked for about 100 kilometers. "We actually get involved in these things from time to time," said Senior Agent Jeffrey Dern, driving the car, grinning as he glanced at Stone Brook in the rearview mirror. "So what, are we going to win the tender again?" Stone Brook, in his late 20s, asked with a laugh. Dern nodded and said, "We are the official face of this business, Stone Brook. Neither the CIA, nor the Deltas, nor the DEA are in the spotlight like we are. That's why we get beaten up first in every 9/11-like disaster," while African-born Agent Samuel Washington, who was sitting in the front right seat of the car, said, "Amen." Washington was not a man of many words. Dern had never seen the big black man in his late 30s join in on this conversation before. He was laughing with amusement at Washington's attitude when Washington suddenly shouted, "RPG." Dern could only clench his teeth and curse when he saw the light darting toward them on their right. Stone Brook ignored the pain in his leg and began to crawl out of the car. His M4 had been blown out of his hands with the onset of the crash. Miller, sitting next to him, touched his radio, but the voices in his earpiece were far away. His ears were still buzzing. Continuing to crawl through the dust, the man finally saw the road and the rest of the convoy. 2 black Skorsky Blake Hawks had landed at the front and back of the armored vehicle. As he was loading the box they had taken from the armored vehicle into the helicopter in front, the young man saw someone approaching him. He raised his hands to signal surrender. The man in black was wearing a bulletproof mask. There was a thick red line running down the middle of the mask. Without hesitation, the man approached Stone Brook and, with a speed that was barely perceptible to the eye, drew his gun and shot the agents in the head, one by one. Then, touching the radio on his left shoulder, similar to the equipment used by FBI tactical teams, he said, "This is clear." There was no survivor of the FBI convoy whose plutonium had been stolen. "What do you mean there are no James Taylor prints?" Agent Carter said, frowning. Duncan looked at the woman and asked, "Was it acid erased?" When the woman on the phone nodded, he asked, "What about her teeth?" Repeating the same question, Carter waited a moment for the answer. "He also had teeth fixed before the accident," Carter said, looking annoyed. Duncan found this oddly normal. Realizing this, Carter hung up and asked, "What does that mean?" Just as his phone rang again, the woman answered with a grunt. "According to the records, James Taylor was an officer in the 104th Logistics Unit," she said. "Somehow I'm not surprised," Duncan grumbled with a smile. Carter was about to ask, when he said, "You'll only get that answer when you get there." According to the GPS, just a few kilometers from the 104th Logistics Unit, Carter's phone rang again. Carter answered the phone without even knowing who was calling, listened to what was being said, then braked hard and stopped in the middle of the road. He stopped so hard that Duncan, who was dozing, almost hit the windshield. However, the man, who did not care, had already put his hand on his hip. The agent, who did not notice this, said in surprise, "The convoy was attacked." "Which convoy?" Duncan asked, raising an eyebrow and looking at her with narrowed eyes. He took his hand off his waist when he realized he wasn't the one being attacked. "The plutonium," Carter said in horror. "They killed all the guards." Duncan was about to say something when his phone started ringing. "Damn it," he grumbled and got out of the car. While he was explaining the situation on the phone, the FBI regional manager who wanted the same explanation was calling Carter. After Carter gave his short report on the phone, Duncan returned to his seat, took a cigarette from his jacket and offered it to Carter. As Carter took the cigarette, he said, "We'll follow James Taylor. Plutonium is not our business anymore." July 28, New York, USA. Scott Donovan. Night had long since fallen over New York. Most workers had long since sunk into the sweet embrace of sleep in order to get up at dawn and go to work. The lights around the tall, shadowy buildings of the city looked like jewels. Despite it being early spring, the air was quite cool. The light emanating from the streets of the city provided a dim illumination even in the attics, allowing everything to be seen vaguely. There was a man moving quickly among the dim shadows. The tall young man was muscular and athletic. His dark brown hair was cut short and messy. His blue eyes were measuring, evaluating and weighing everything he saw. Despite his high pace, he was only slightly sweaty. The building of the flat roof he was running on was occasionally interrupted, leaving gaps of a few meters, just like the other blocks. When the young man came to such a gap, he neither paused nor slowed down. He reached the high concrete railing of the apartment roof in one step and pushed himself from there and jumped. Leaping from the 10-story apartment building, the young man crossed the narrow alley and landed on the gravel-covered floor of the 9-story apartment building. The young man, who did a soft somersault to soften his fall, adjusted his sports backpack and continued running as if he had never stopped. He was wearing a loose smoke-colored t-shirt, dark-colored comfortable denim and running shoes. When he reached the end of the apartment building, he changed direction slightly and jumped again. He turned back in the air, pulled his legs to his stomach and extended his arms, catching the fire escape railings protruding from the side of the roof. The young man, who placed his feet and hands on the sides of the groaning stairs as if protesting against a sudden load, silently landed on the fire exit balcony on the lower floor. It took a considerable agility like a cat to do this. He passed the fire escapes and balconies made of metal profiles and stopped somewhere in the middle of the building. The young man leaned over the window and looked inside, listening to the house for a while in silence. After making sure that there was no sound or light, he took out a small fruit knife that was hidden behind a flower pot on the sill. He inserted the thin knife into the thin gap of the window and pushed it. Using the gap that opened, he lifted the window and entered. There was no light in the room except for the faint light coming from outside. In the darkness, a bed, an armchair, library shelves and the vague outlines of a computer could be seen. The young man was smiling, taking off his backpack and throwing it on the bed when the voice from the armchair said, "You really are an idiot, Scott." The young man must have been 15 years old at most. The young man, who had frozen, only then realized that his brother was sitting in the armchair across from him. Rising angrily from the armchair, the older brother approached Scott and said through his teeth, "That psychopathic policeman is still waiting for you in front of the building, across the street, and you go out like an idiot." The older brother was taller and thinner than Scott. His golden hair was cut in a bob and combed back as usual. When they came together in daylight, it was obvious that they did not resemble each other at all, but in this darkness, no one cared. "Somehow I'm not surprised," Duncan grumbled with a smile. Carter was about to ask, when he said, "You'll only get that answer when you get there." According to the GPS, just a few kilometers from the 104th Logistics Unit, Carter's phone rang again. Carter answered the phone without even knowing who was calling, listened to what was being said, then braked hard and stopped in the middle of the road. He stopped so hard that Duncan, who was dozing, almost hit the windshield. However, the man, who did not care, had already put his hand on his hip. The agent, who did not notice this, said in surprise, "The convoy was attacked." "Which convoy?" Duncan asked, raising an eyebrow and looking at her with narrowed eyes. He took his hand off his waist when he realized he wasn't the one being attacked. "The plutonium," Carter said in horror. "They killed all the guards." Duncan was about to say something when his phone started ringing. "Damn it," he grumbled and got out of the car. While he was explaining the situation on the phone, the FBI regional manager who wanted the same explanation was calling Carter. After Carter gave his short report on the phone, Duncan returned to his seat, took a cigarette from his jacket and offered it to Carter. As Carter took the cigarette, he said, "We'll follow James Taylor. Plutonium is not our business anymore." July 28, New York, USA. Scott Donovan. Night had long since fallen over New York. Most workers had long since sunk into the sweet embrace of sleep in order to get up at dawn and go to work. The lights around the tall, shadowy buildings of the city looked like jewels. Despite it being early spring, the air was quite cool. The light emanating from the streets of the city provided a dim illumination even in the attics, allowing everything to be seen vaguely. There was a man moving quickly among the dim shadows. The tall young man was muscular and athletic. His dark brown hair was cut short and messy. His blue eyes were measuring, evaluating and weighing everything he saw. Despite his high pace, he was only slightly sweaty. The building of the flat roof he was running on was occasionally interrupted, leaving gaps of a few meters, just like the other blocks. When the young man came to such a gap, he neither paused nor slowed down. He reached the high concrete railing of the apartment roof in one step and pushed himself from there and jumped. Leaping from the 10-story apartment building, the young man crossed the narrow alley and landed on the gravel-covered floor of the 9-story apartment building. The young man, who did a soft somersault to soften his fall, adjusted his sports backpack and continued running as if he had never stopped. He was wearing a loose smoke-colored t-shirt, dark-colored comfortable denim and running shoes. When he reached the end of the apartment building, he changed direction slightly and jumped again. He turned back in the air, pulled his legs to his stomach and extended his arms, catching the fire escape railings protruding from the side of the roof. The young man, who placed his feet and hands on the sides of the groaning stairs as if protesting against a sudden load, silently landed on the fire exit balcony on the lower floor. It took a considerable agility like a cat to do this. He passed the fire escapes and balconies made of metal profiles and stopped somewhere in the middle of the building. The young man leaned over the window and looked inside, listening to the house for a while in silence. After making sure that there was no sound or light, he took out a small fruit knife that was hidden behind a flower pot on the sill. He inserted the thin knife into the thin gap of the window and pushed it. Using the gap that opened, he lifted the window and entered. There was no light in the room except for the faint light coming from outside. In the darkness, a bed, an armchair, library shelves and the vague outlines of a computer could be seen. The young man was smiling, taking off his backpack and throwing it on the bed when the voice from the armchair said, "You really are an idiot, Scott." The young man must have been 15 years old at most. The young man, who had frozen, only then realized that his brother was sitting in the armchair across from him. Rising angrily from the armchair, the older brother approached Scott and said through his teeth, "That psychopathic policeman is still waiting for you in front of the building, across the street, and you go out like an idiot." The older brother was taller and thinner than Scott. His golden hair was cut in a bob and combed back as usual. When they came together in daylight, it was obvious that they did not resemble each other at all, but in this darkness, no one cared. "Oh, come on, Stephen. No one can see me coming and going. No one's going to arrest me just because I want to see my friends," Scott sighed, turning on the desk lamp on his desk, a deep scar forming a dramatic line across his cheekbone and jaw. Stephen reached his hand up to his head as if to comb his hair back, a move that was just out of habit. "You tell that to the jury. The guy hasn't let go of his tail for a year. If you keep this up, he'll catch up to you eventually." Scott took off his t-shirt, which had absorbed almost all of his sweat, and said angrily, "I didn't do anything." Stephen's eyes were fixated on the hideous burn scar across the back of his brother's right arm and most of his back. "It doesn't matter," he replied, shaking his head as he tried to clear the pained expression on his face and left Scott's room. "It doesn't matter," Detective Kowalski said. The big man was in a Dodge Avenger, one of the standard plainclothes vehicles of the New York Police Department. He was talking to his partner on a silver cell phone. "This bastard is in charge of everything. He may not be on his phone, but he's sure to make a mistake," he said angrily. The big man had a short-haired nose that had once been broken. His brown eyes scanned the floors and entrances of the building diagonally across from him. His partner on the other end of the phone tried to calm him down by saying, "Adiron, you may be right, but we have no evidence. There's only rumors that the Icemen are regrouping. No judge would sign a surveillance order based on rumors alone. None of our informants could say anything definitive. We took down that gang, my friend. No, the force can't bring them back together. They haven't been seen in 6 months. Their leader was stabbed in prison. He's been dead for 4 months. Who's going to bring them back together? Can Scott Donovan really do it?" Adrian Kowalski sighed and looked at the lunchbox on the seat next to him. "I think the bastard could do it," he muttered, and pulled his hamburger out of a paper bag. 6 months ago, He and his partner Jimmy Lee Farson had taken down the Icemen, one of New York's most vicious street gangs. And they had done it red-handed during a robbery. Jimmy was wounded in the ensuing gunfight, and 3 cops and 6 gang members were killed. The remaining 13 thugs were sent to state prison with sentences of an average of 25 years. But about 3 months ago, the city's grapevine had begun talking about the Icemen gathering again. Adrian kept running into dead ends when he investigated. His informants had either disappeared or been deafened by a sudden outbreak of fear. No one knew if the gang had really gathered. Adrian's only lead was Scott Donovan, and he wasn't about to give up on it. He took a big bite of his hamburger, said, "See you later, partner," and hung up. Scott might not be in his old neighborhood. He might have fooled everyone and said he was starting a new life. But Kowalski knew the shifty, sneaky bastard. He couldn't fool him. The broad-shouldered, pale-eyed lawman with the graying sides of his hair would have to wait. Sooner or later, the arrogant bastard would make a mistake. In the morning, an unexpected fog had paralyzed traffic in New York. So Scott, his older brother Stephen, and their father George had gotten out early. Scott was sprawled in the backseat, absently watching the streets. It was one of those silvery days, unseasonably New York. According to the weather forecast, the sun would come out in the afternoon and the air would warm up. But those who went outside had a hard time believing it when they looked at the cool, humid weather. George Donovan was tall like Scott's older brother. His long, graying hair was combed to the side as usual. When he stopped at a red light, he trimmed his goatee, checked the rear view and side mirrors for anyone being followed, and then he said, "The detective seems to have given up on you today, Scott." "He's got something more important to do," Scott muttered as he watched 2 pretty girls around his own age emerge from a coffee shop. "Maybe he stopped following you," his older brother Stephen texted his best friend Patrick Maine on his cell phone. Scott laughed wryly and said, "That animal never stops." At this moment, George, who turned onto the Ocean Express when the green light turned on, said calmly, "You never know, Scott, there are laws." George Donovan was working as a lawyer in a construction company. He had wanted to complain about the detective's long-term pursuit, but Scott's file at the police station was quite thick. This could hurt Scott more than the detective. In addition, a restraining order would make Scott more of a suspect and they would question him in every case where a connection could be established. George couldn't help but glance at the young boy in the rearview mirror. Scott's least problem was Detective Kowalski. George had divorced Scott's mother Patricia about 5 years ago. Scott had been living with his mother, who was a drug addict. The court had previously refused custody of George, who had anger issues. Patricia, who had been getting more and more into drug addiction, had finally gotten really high about 4 months ago. The poor woman had been so high that she hadn't even realized that the cigarette she had dropped on her bed had started a fire. Scott had tried to save the unconscious woman, but he hadn't been able to. So Scott was now staying with George and Stephen. He would sometimes sneak out at night, and he didn't talk much. His grades were just a few steps away from being terrible. George knew he could do better, but he had no choice but to be understanding. What they had been through was terrible, and he needed some time. His other son, Stephen, who was sitting next to him, was a completely different matter. Scott's older brother, Stephen, was from George's first marriage. Stephen's mother had not wanted Stephen around when she was entering into a new marriage and had sent him to George. The court had no say in this voluntary agreement. Neither Stephen nor George had objected to the situation anyway. All 3 of them were very happy from their own perspectives. They were a small family of unwanted people. They all had their own problems, but they did not reflect these on each other. They were careful not to intrude on each other's space. Beyond that, George and Stephen were even happy that Scott had tragically joined them. Even though Scott and Stephen had different mothers and different lives, they were so fond of each other that the boundary stones that their lives had built around them disappeared immediately. Ocean Drive was lined with trees, planted at regular intervals on both sides. 2-story brick houses stood just beyond the trees. George glanced at the yellow school buses heading in the same direction as them up the road and couldn't help but check his watch. "Stephen, I don't want Scott to get into a fight with anyone," he said. Just as Scott was about to object, Stephen turned around and winked at Scott before saying, "Don't worry, Dad. Scott is mature and sensible enough to know who to fight with and who not to. Besides, no sane person at Lincoln High would ever want to fight with him again." Scott leaned back in the chair, smiling involuntarily at his brother. George looked at his young son in the rearview mirror and said seriously, "Yes, young man. Being right and lucky about that might not save you next time. If they weren't so stupid as to ask you for money with a knife in front of the school cameras, the headmaster would have looked at your files and fired you first." "I wouldn't have fought them if they hadn't pulled out a knife," Scott grumbled, nodding in understanding. "But I like my kidneys better." Stephen glanced at his father and saw George looking at him. He shrugged and said, "The kid's right." George laughed at that and muttered, "What am I telling anyone? You're both my sons. I was just as stupid as you when I was younger." At that moment, the red Volvo S60 sedan driven by George stopped in front of Abraham Lincoln High School. George smiled again as he looked after Stephen and Scott, who got out of the car, and muttered, "At least we're together." At that moment, Scott was looking at the white Bentley at the school entrance. A man in his 70s, dressed in a white suit like his car, got out of the white luxury car. He had a white Panama hat and a thin cane. For some reason, Scott thought the man didn't belong here, or even in this time. However, none of them noticed the black Chrysler that was following them. The man in the black suit, in his 30s, took pictures of Stephen and Scott and wrote down their entries in his notebook. July 28, New York, USA. Joe? According to Joanna Swanson, it was an ordinary day in the New York Times. Joanna had just turned 25, and with her long legs and shapely body, she was beautiful enough to easily attract the attention of all the men around her wherever she walked. Although many people compared her to the famous model of the 80s, Cindy Crawford, she was not very happy about it. She wore a tight black skirt that fell below her knees, high-heeled round-toed closed-toe shoes, a tight blouse that revealed her shapely and large breasts, and a tight black vest. The slit at the back of her skirt went up to her thighs. She had tied her raven hair, which reached her waist, into a ponytail. The young woman wore black horn-rimmed glasses instead of her usual rimless glasses. The black eyeliner in her big blue eyes behind her glasses both highlighted her eyes and added a stern expression. The young woman, who was a real center of attraction, was a complete trap, as Perry put it. Contrary to what men who could not study because of watching her believed, Joanna was a very intelligent woman. She had graduated from Princeton University, Department of Journalism, with second place. Her father was one of the city's most famous stockbrokers. Her mother was a respected surgeon and, more importantly, a hospital administrator. Joanna was very patient, organized, careful, and idealistic. But most importantly, she didn't need money. He would put this young woman, who never forgot anything, on the dangerous journalists list. Although her father knew the owner of the newspaper, he had specifically wanted to work with Duke Perry for 2 years. This had raised many eyebrows. Joanna Swanson would work with anyone she pointed out with her cute pink fingers, but no one understood why she wanted the old, alcoholic reporter who had only been covering small local news for the last 10 years. When Duke arrived at his large office space, most of the office staff sighed deeply and went back to their work. Many resented Duke for coming to take care of Joanna, but they were glad to be back at work. Perry sat at his desk and turned on his computer. He held up a pointed finger to Joanna as she walked toward him. "Good morning," he said. "Coffee, no cream and 2 sugars," the girl mimicked the gesture before Duke could finish his sentence. Duke lowered his index finger and raised his thumb with a pleased expression on his face. "Yes, Joe, and..." "The morning editions of the other papers," Joanna said, pointing again at Duke. Perry had reached his desk by this time. He looked at the table, which was tidied and cleaned as usual, and grunted, "Bravo and..." "And?" The girl paused. She had been working for Perry for 4 months and there had never been an end. She turned curiously and looked at Perry, who leaned back in his chair that creaked with his weight when he sat down. "How long have you worked for me?" Perry asked, clasping her fingers behind her neck. 119 days, the girl said without hesitation. What have you been doing these 119 days? Perry asked, grimacing and pretending to remember. I got you coffee, answered your phone, and wiped your desk, she said, trying to sound calm as she put her hands on her hips and shifted her weight from her right leg to her left. She didn't understand what Perry was getting at. But he had been trying to convince her to intern with other reporters since the day he arrived, so she was afraid he would start a new persuasion pitch for her. Aren't you bored? Perry asked, wincing as if he were in pain. Yes, I am bored. Very bored, said Joanna with a sigh. Would you like to do anything besides get me some good coffee and a newspaper? Perry asked, keeping his cool. What about? Joanna asked cautiously, her eyes narrowing. The last time a conversation like this had ended, Perry had sent her off to buy lottery tickets. Do you have any work tonight? Perry asked, leaning against his desk. She wasn't sure if Duke Perry wanted to go out with her or if she had something else in mind. So she asked in a cautious tone, does going to the movies with my boyfriend count as work? As she crossed her arms in front of her chest. Duke was a seasoned journalist. He had long ago learned human responses and body language. If we're doing business, does it count? He asked with a grin. Joanna's big blue eyes widened with joy. If we're doing business, it doesn't count. Will it break his heart if you ditch him? Who cares about his heart? He's just a man. Wasn't that too cruel? If you don't tell me, I won't tell you either. She looks so cute when she smiles, Joanna said with a grin, almost jumping up and down like a little girl whose father has bought her a pony. Good, check out the news on Blackwater and other civilian security companies in the third invasion of Iraq by tonight. We'll meet at West 55th Street and 10th Avenue around 8 p.m., Perry said with a smile. Okay, boss, she said, almost jumping and pulling herself together, and turned to get Perry's newspaper and coffee. Oh, and Joe, Duke called after her, calmly. Joanna's hair flew as she spun around in excitement. Duke was sure he heard a gasp from many places in the office at that moment. The young woman opened her round eyes, arched her eyebrows, and said, yes? With a look of innocence. Change your clothes and try not to be sexy, will you? Duke said with a smile, scratching his beard with a rustling sound. Joanna smiled with her smooth lips. I'll try, boss, she said with a smile. Her tone and smile said she didn't believe it was possible. Duke smiled as he watched Joanna walk away cheerfully, for as if to prove her smug attitude, many heads turned to look at her as she went to get coffee. Hey Perry, said the voice Duke had known for nearly 30 years, just after Joanna had walked away. Perry smiled and turned in his chair. What's up, Chief? He said calmly. The chief was Richard Firstman, the Times editor-in-chief. Firstman was a thin man, close to 6 feet tall. His graying hair was no more than 3 fingers long. His eyes were dark green behind round glasses that matched his oval face. He wore black slacks, black patent shoes, and a white shirt. His tie was loose, as usual. Duke never understood why he wore it, because he had never seen it pull those damned lapels together. The man, who was approaching 60, always had a grim look on his face. Duke thought he looked like a drill sergeant in the movies. Leaning across the table, Firstman said, I've got a nice job for you, with his usual serious expression. It was his way of smiling and saying good morning. Although the others found him very cold, Perry had now untangled the man. Nodding in agreement, he asked, what's the deal? Someone cloned the New York Library's data, Firstman muttered, straightening up and clasping his hands together with a serious expression. If they didn't steal it, how did it come about? What did they copy anyway? Duke asked curiously. Everything. Patrick Hobbs from Theft Squad was there, we just talked. They think they might have infiltrated the library in DC too. Go check it out, you can ask him those questions too, Firstman said gruffly as he headed back to his office. All right, boss, Duke said as he rose from his desk. That's what he'd been telling Firstman when he hired him for nearly 30 years. Duke Perry looked at Joanna as she came in with her coffee and waved her over. Remember, Work until 8. The building on the corner of 40th Street and 5th Avenue was one of the most famous libraries in the world. Bryant Park was behind it. New York Public Library. The library, which was one of the most popular locations in many movies, was also one of the 3 largest libraries in the United States. The library, founded in 1895, was one of the most beautiful examples of architecture of the period. 2 lion figures guarded the steps at its entrance. There were 2 cups in the vaults next to it. The entrance of the library, which had 3 doors a few meters apart, always reminded Duke of ancient Greek temples. Just before reaching the entrance, Duke smiled when he saw the person he was looking for on the left side of the stairs. Sergeant Patrick Hobbs, an African American, was a smoker just like him. He must have gone outside to smoke. Duke went to the black man who was sheltered in the shadow of the car behind the lion statue on the left side and smiled and asked, "You got a fever, buddy?" Patrick Hobbs was a tall, big man like Duke. He had just entered his 40s. Duke knew the cop, who wore a linen suit and white shirt, to be one of New York's honest men. Hobbs, who had grown up in a gang in the Bronx, had been mobbed by a Spanish gang and spent 2 months in a coma. When he woke up, he was alone in the world. Everyone he knew had been killed in a gang war that had started the day he was shot. Hobbs graduated from high school a year after leaving the hospital and enrolled in the police academy, graduating 3rd in the class. He had been wounded many times and had been awarded medals for bravery and distinguished service. His adventurous nature had calmed down a bit when he met and married an emergency room doctor. So now he was on the burglary squad. The man, who always kept his curly black hair cut short, had thick eyebrows and an oval face, and he pulled a lighter from his jacket. "You have to be careful, these things kill you," he said. "We both know we're not going to die from smoking, man," Duke said with a wry laugh, lighting his cigarette with the flame from the lighter he was offered and taking a deep drag. Patrick Hobbs nodded and laughed. "You're right, how are you?" Duke straightened with a lit cigarette and shrugged. "Older, more tired," he muttered. "You must be feeling right." "You look just as you described," Hobbs said with a laugh. "Hey, be nice, you're hurting my naive heart," Duke growled, pretending to be hurt. "What am I hurting you about?" asked Patrick Hobbs, laughing cheerfully. "My heart," Duke grumbled, pointing to his right breast with his left hand. Hobbs, who got the joke, continued to laugh and said, "Don't they make you journalists out of printing press parts?" in an attempt to sound serious. Duke smiled and made a wry noise. "They make cops out of gun parts now. Also, I talked to the Wizard of Oz. He gave me a heart." "That wasn't bad," Patrick Hobbs commended the reporter, curling his lower lip and nodding slightly. "I worked hard," Duke said with a shrug. "How are Laura and Penny?" the smiling police officer asked. "They're still in California. My darling girl Penny called me no good, drunk or something like that the other day. I didn't quite catch it because I was so drunk. But I believe they're all right," Duke muttered, taking a deep drag on his cigarette. Hobbs wasn't one to feel sorry for people and cry while hugging them. "It's not unfair, you've been drinking too much," he said directly to Duke. Duke didn't seem to mind. "There's nothing I can do better." "So what, Pat?" he asked, changing the subject. At midnight, the guard decided to walk because he was very gassy, Patrick Hobbs began, pointing inside. "So he went around at a different time than his routine patrol," Duke said, completing Hobbs' scenario to show he understood his point of view. Detective Hobbs nodded. "Exactly. He saw movement in the computer room, had the good sense to call 911. But the others inside noticed him. They threw a stun grenade, nearly frightening the poor guy to death, and then ran away. Of course, he can't hear or see very well now." Duke's eyebrows rose. "Shock bomb?" he asked curiously. This wasn't a method used in normal robberies, muggings or hacking incidents. In fact, this was the first time he had heard of it. Hobbs nodded. "Yeah, the military type of stuff we have," he said, referring to the stun grenades used by the Emergency Service Unit, ASU, teams. When thrown, the stun grenades would produce a loud flash and sound, sending people into a visual and sensory shock. The ASU teams took advantage of this opportunity to buy themselves a short time to neutralize their suspects. The military stun grenades were more powerful than the ones used by the police. Where did they get the military stun grenade? Duke asked, scratching his beard curiously. Alvarez got the serial number of the bomb. He's investigating it now, Patrick Hobbs said with a shrug, referring to his partner, Camilla Alvarez. Isn't this weird? Duke asked, looking around the library. New York City hadn't had a hack that involved physical effort in a long time. Hobbs took one last drag on his cigarette, spilling the embers and rolling up the filter. What part of it is normal? The library's IT manager said all the records were cloned, and that they'd been doing it every day for almost a week. Things got more interesting when he said the libraries were connected. Someone from FBI Cybercrimes is coming right now, he grumbled. He really didn't like the FBI. Oh, things are getting bigger, Duke said, raising his eyebrows and laughing. He knew what Hobbs thought of the FBI. Their coming and taking the crime scene from him must have been driving his old friend crazy. At that moment, Patrick Hobbs' partner, Camilla Alvarez, approached. The woman in her early 30s smiled when she saw Duke and said, "Oh, old man, I thought you were dead." The athletic Hispanic woman, 5 feet tall, came over to the pair, the left of her almond hazel eyes winking flirtatiously. She wore a gray suit with flat shoes that allowed her to move freely. Her athletic body was visible despite her suit. She had cut her black hair to a thickness of 2 fingers, like an officer's, at most. This made the woman's appeal much worse than it was. She was holding a tablet computer. "I haven't had the chance yet, Peanut. Are you sure you won't have dinner with this old man one night before you die?" Duke said with a smile. Hobbs grinned and said, "Hey Grandpa, don't hit on my partner." Camilla approached, kissed the Duke on the cheek and hugged him. "How are you, old wolf? Did they send you to get news?" she asked. "Aren't you overqualified for this?" "I was bored sitting around. What about you? Anything from the stun grenade?" Duke asked, shrugging. As Camilla looked at Patrick Hobbs with furrowed brows, Hobbs defended himself by spreading his hands on both sides and asking, "What, do you want to hide it from him?" "If you really want to bribe, Sergeant Alvarez, I can take you out to dinner tonight, then you can drug my drink and rape me however you want," Duke said with a flirtatious smile. Camilla looked at the Duke with a hearty smile like a waterfall and said, "Why not? But your bomb business is a dead end. 2 years ago, the bombs were stolen from a truck belonging to LGG while they were being transported." "What is LGG?" Hobbs asked. "Lifeguarding Group," Duke said, "is a security company that's 5-6 years old," he added. "Never heard of it," Hobbs grumbled. "Naturally," said the Duke, putting one hand in his pocket. "They are a body of professional soldiers who protect the investments of large corporations abroad." "Like the ones in Iraq?" Hobbs asked, guardedly. Duke shook his head and said, "The kids in Iraq are like innocent children with snowballs in their hands." He didn't like this sound bomb business at all, which was probably why the chief had sent him away. He asked Patrick Hobbs and Alvarez a few more questions and then decided to return to the newspaper. This was going to be an interesting story. Duke Perry called Adam Coleman on his cell phone as he was walking away from the library. When he heard a hello, Duke got straight to the point. "Coleman, it's Duke. Firstman sent me to the library incident. Something strange is happening here. The people who broke into the library used a stun grenade to stop the guard. According to the serial number on the stun grenade, it was taken from LGG's truck that was robbed 2 years ago. They were used in the hack today. I need anything you can find on the subject," he said. Coleman was in his late 50s, 6 feet tall, 90 pounds, and very athletic for his age. He always kept his hair cut short, in a sailor style. The green-eyed Irishman with rimless glasses was the chief of intelligence at the New York Times. There were many rumors about Coleman. Some said he was a former FBI agent, others a CIA agent. There was no solid information on the subject. Whenever they asked Coleman about it, the middle-aged man would just smile. The one thing that was certain was that whatever a person could learn, Coleman learned it. As he looked out the window of his office, Coleman said in a sarcastic tone, "I'm fine too, thanks. But it's really good. Give me until tonight," and hung up. The rusty, oil-less cogs in Duke's brain that had been left in dark corners were starting to work again. He was glad to be back on the field. Suddenly he realized that he was walking smiling to himself and scratched his beard as if he had scabies. First he had to talk to the night guard who had been taken to the hospital, then he had to go home and take a good shower. New chapter. Ghosts see everything. July 28, New York, USA. Stephen Donovan. Abraham Lincoln High School was a 4-story building complex with a small yard fenced in by iron fencing. The building was made up of several T-shaped sections with a football field and tennis courts and a baseball field running along the side. Stephen smiled and waved when he saw his friend Patrick Maine, whom he had been texting with in the car. Then he tapped Scott on the shoulder and winked. "Dad's right, Scott. Don't break the rules of your parole. I'll see you when you get out." He smiled and left Scott. Stephen had met Patrick when he first came to school. Patrick was the only person with whom he had almost perfect tastes. The red-haired young man was a little shorter than Stephen, but more muscular. He was a forward on the school's football team. He stuck his fist out at his friend who approached him and said, "Hey, 5-hole. Hi, sunshine. It's a miracle you even got your damn white ass up to catch the school bus," Stephen laughed, bumping the outstretched fist with his own. Patrick put his arm around Stephen's shoulders. "The only reason for this is Gloria Fitzgerald, man. I couldn't miss her," he said, nodding toward the tall Latina girl in front of them, her curly hair hanging down to her shapely hips. Stephen's eyes narrowed so much as to form a line as he laughed. "Why didn't I think Gloria and her ass were involved?" he said. Patrick waved his other hand. "That's your general problem, you don't think much. When you think of thinking, it comes to mind. Why are you leaving your brother alone, you moron? If we fight again, your father will come like a storm. If I take him too seriously, he won't grow up strong on his own. It'll be better for him if we watch him from a distance," Stephen said, watching Scott, who was looking down at a book as Stephen came up behind them alone. "Besides, if he doesn't do anything wrong, no one will notice him," he said. Scott always walked with his back hunched, never drawing attention to himself, and dressed like the average high school student. Stephen always called him Ghost. Strangely enough, Scott had taken to it so much that he even had a tattoo on his left shoulder that he got the ghosts of everything tattooed on his left shoulder. He had written it down. Scott was very special to Stephen. First of all, he was his brother. Nothing could tear his love for this self-assured young man from his heart. They had talked on the phone almost every day, every evening since they had known each other. Although they had shared different lives with different families, the two brothers thought and acted the same way. Their interests and preferences were of course different. Stephen had learned to fight in the neighborhood. He loved basketball and never missed an NBA game. Scott, on the other hand, grew up in the slums of New York. The boy, who had the responsibility of taking care of his always high mother, first learned Nambudo karate as a sport. He soon began learning Krav Maga. His father, concerned about him, wanted to enroll him in Boy Scouts, but he enrolled in wilderness survival courses that required more rigorous training. These courses were taught by former military men. Stephen always knew there was more to Scott than met the eye. He would go jogging every night and do parkour with French immigrants. The boy, who did this with 1-pound weights on his feet and 1-pound weights on his ankles, was in the theater department at school. Despite his diverse interests, he was very shy. He had almost no friends. "Wow, you're so much wiser than I expected," Patrick said, raising an eyebrow. "No one is aware of my wisdom and genius," Stephen said with a cocky grin. By this time they had entered the school. The wide corridors of the old school, well lit with brightly colored walls, were filled with students. The sound of a girl's scream and shouts echoing through the hallways where the sound of student voices had become a hum had drawn the two friends' attention to this place. As Stephen pushed through the crowd, he spotted Mike Sullivan in the center of the circle. The sweat-suited young man, larger than himself, had arrived from Boston last year. With his blonde hair gelled back, Sullivan had shown everyone how much of a problem he could be as soon as he arrived at school. He was either in the middle of or on the fringes of every fight or disturbance at school. Last week's incident had been one of these. The Spanish thug Stephen had seen around Mike several times had cornered Scott after school. When Scott refused to do what they wanted, things got tense, and one of the boys pulled a switchblade on Scott, which turned ugly. By the time the school's security guard, James Corbane, called 911 to break up the fight, Scott had broken the wrist of the Spaniard who had pulled the knife on him and injured his friend's knee so badly that he would never be able to run again. When both boys spoke to Mike at the police station, Mike Sullivan escaped unscathed, only referring to him as a friend. Breaking through the crowd, Stephen saw Mike's Starbucks cup first. Mike Sullivan was hitting his girlfriend Emma Harper again with the durable plastic cup, and his voice was thick and rusty. "You can only break up with me when I tell you to, bitch." The girl's nose was broken, her lips split open. Her eyes were open, but their pupils had rolled up so far that only the whites were visible. Stephen looked around for a moment. Everyone was watching Mike and Emma in horror, but no one was moving. A few of the bastards had been filming the incident with their phones. Stephen made his move just before he heard the whistle coming from down the hall. He knew that the whistle belonged to James Corbane, and that he had to break up this fight. But Emma didn't look like she could take another few blows. Even if she could, Stephen thought that no self-respecting man should remain silent in such a situation. The young man hadn't noticed that the people watching the incident included those who had been gathered around Mike since he had arrived at the school. Mike raised his hand again with a cruel smile on his face, and was about to lower it when he realized someone had grabbed his wrist and was roughly pulling him back. He spun around quickly, a numbing blow to his jaw, and he found himself slamming into the steel lockers diagonally across from him. He spun around violently, trying to strike Stephen, who was punching him, but Stephen blocked his punch with his arm. Stephen followed immediately with another punch to the young man's face. Gomez, one of Mike's friends, came up behind Stephen and reached to throw his arm around the young man's throat, but Patrick stopped him by grabbing the hood of his sweatshirt and pulling him back. The big red-haired man threw Gomez back with all his might, and two people from the crowd jumped at Patrick and one at Stephen. Stephen hadn't seen the person coming from behind him. All his attention was on Mike Sullivan in front of him. Stephen, who had kicked Sullivan in the face, vaguely saw Scott jump out of the crowd in front of him. Scott, acting in a manner quite contrary to the calm expression on his face, threw the can of cola in his hand at Stephen. Stephen had accelerated considerably with the adrenaline of the fight. He heard the wind sound of the can of cola as he pulled his head to the side, but at that moment he was looking at Scott in surprise. When he heard the crash and grunt coming from behind him, he realized that his brother was not looking at him, but at someone behind him. When he turned around, he saw Harold Kimberly lying on the ground. There was a ring formed by the bottom of the can of cola on the young man's forehead. The exploded can of cola was spinning on the ground with a hiss, while the students were cheering and laughing enthusiastically. As Scott passed him, he glanced at his brother for a brief moment and winked. Stephen saw a half-smile cross his brother's expressionless face for a moment. At that moment, he noticed Mike's friends James and Pike attacking him from his left, and he threw his arms up to protect himself from the incoming punch. As Patrick stepped back to protect himself from the two young men attacking him, one of the young men suddenly disappeared from view. While Patrick and the other boy were looking at what was happening, the second attacker also disappeared in a blue navy storm. The name of the angry storm was Eric Jonas. The short, broad-shouldered man, who was the defender of the football team, ran up and shouldered the attacker and threw him towards the exit door. The first attacker was currently being mauled by the football team's left-back player Anton Robertson and Alan Harper. Seeing this, Patrick couldn't help but grin. The team wouldn't leave those who were his alone. Stephen waited for James, who was constantly attacking him with kicks and punches, to make an opening. When he finally saw the opening he was looking for, Stephen punched James in the chest, forcing him to back away. When he saw James pause, he knocked his young opponent down with 3 accurate punches in quick succession. Meanwhile, Stephen, who was looking worriedly at the chaos around him, saw his brother knock 2 more people down. Smiling proudly at his brother, Stephen turned to look at Scott and realized something was terribly wrong. But it was too late. He was hit hard in the head by an explosion that sounded like a hammer from behind him. All he saw before everything went black was Scott moving towards him. Scott took one last look at Mike Sullivan, who was standing behind him as he held his brother who had fallen towards him. Sullivan held a short-barreled .357 Magnum in his right hand. His face was full of wrinkles, his nose broken and his eyebrows wide. But Scott didn't care. His face was covered in blood spatter from his brother's face. All he cared about was stopping the blood flowing from his brother's head. The hot blood that felt like it was burning at that moment was sending bone and brain fragments into his hands, but Scott continued to press the wounds without hesitation. The chaos that had erupted in the hallway along with the shooting was nothing more than unnecessary noise to Scott. He looked up to ask for help and saw Mike Sullivan was gone. Patrick was a few feet away. He was on his knees, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. One of the 2 football players with Patrick called 911 on his phone while the other ran to Scott. He handed him a towel from his bag and said something, but Scott was too far from hearing him. All he could do was try to close the 2 holes in his brother's head, his eyes fixated on the blood slowly spreading down the hallway. July 28, New York, USA. Duke Perry. As the day gave way to evening, the heat was fading. After taking a shower, shaving, and changing his clothes, Duke stuck a small toothpick in the crack of the door as he left the house. It was a simple precaution he had learned to detect if someone had broken into his house. He did this out of habit rather than paranoia or caution. In fact, it was to maintain his self-respect. These small precautions reminded him of who he had once been. It reminded him that he was a man who told people the truth when they cared about newspapers and the news. He wore cream-colored slacks over brown loafers and a dirt-colored safari shirt for a shirt. He wore a light hunting jacket. It was clearly going to be a chilly evening for July. He headed straight for the Essex subway station, 2 blocks north. As soon as Duke got out of the subway station, he lit a cigarette with his old gasoline lighter. He realized that he couldn't hear the crackling of the tobacco turning to embers, and he felt a little sad about it. He took a deep breath and looked up. But when he couldn't see anything because of the buildings and the streetlights, he let the smoke billow out in a long cloud. New Yorkers who lived in the dark shadows of tall buildings never missed it. They lived and died in a New York that was bright, dark, shadowy, hot and cold. They were used to it because they had never had to question it. But Duke had spent most of his life outside of New York. He had been to Iraq, Cambodia, Libya, and Syria. The only thing he missed from those places was seeing the sky. He smiled when he saw a hot dog vendor. Living in New York had its good points. Like hot dogs. The journalist, who had picked up his hot dog, met his intern Joanna, who was waiting for him at the corner they had agreed on earlier. She had her hair braided in a fishtail braid, and she was wearing form-fitting denim jeans, running shoes, and a windbreaker. A burgundy scarf was wrapped around her neck. Duke realized desperately that no matter what she did, she could never be far from attractive. Joanna was a beautiful woman, and her beauty was noticeable, which opened some doors, but it was not the kind of advantage Duke wanted to attract attention and be remembered for. The young woman smiled when she saw him and said, "Good evening, boss." Her voice was as lively as ever. "Hi Joe, have you been waiting long?" Perry asked, smiling. The young woman looked Duke up and down while shaking her head and said, "No, I just got here. You look very stylish." "Oh, good. I thought you'd been waiting here for half an hour, afraid I'd give you the slip," Duke said slyly, smiling as he acknowledged the compliment. "Is it that obvious?" Joanna asked, her cheeks flushing and biting her lower lip. She looked like a child who had broken a vase and been caught by her mother. Smiling with the wisdom of a seasoned old man, Duke pointed in their direction and said, if you learn to look. I wasn't afraid you'd get the better of me. I wasn't afraid, but I'm so excited and impatient. I might be a little early, Joanna said, her voice thick. She looked at her slender hands and rubbed them together as she said this. Duke laughed at her attitude and lit another cigarette. You smoke too much, Joanna said, frowning. For the first time, Duke noticed a change in the young woman's tone. But he couldn't decide what to make of the change. He pushed it to the back of his mind to think about later. Yes, I know, he said calmly. You know what cigarettes do, Joanna said, stuffing her hands into the pockets of her windbreaker. Joe, I've been too long in this dirty, boring world. Believe me, I'm not eager to spend 5 minutes more, grumbled the Duke, letting out a long cloud of smoke. For a moment, a somber shadow crossed Joanna's face, and she could tell that Duke meant what he was saying, despite his smile. Duke had won 3 Pulitzer Prizes. His last was for his coverage of Iraq. The Pulitzer Prize was an important award given by Columbia University in New York City for journalism, literature, and music. It was a kind of Olympic medal for journalists. Considered the highest and most prestigious award in America, the Pulitzer Prize was founded in the 19th century by Joseph Pulitzer, a Hungarian journalist of Jewish origin. The winners were determined by an independent committee. The man who had spent months in Iraq for his latest award had been in the Gulf War, Sarajevo, and Cambodia in his youth. According to the newspaper, many of his articles had been secretly censored. The editors could not even remember how many times they had called the New York Times from Washington, D.C., to silence him. Now the old man was doing small news stories for New York, only going back and forth to the newspaper. In short, he was waiting for retirement. The New York Times had been quietly sold last year to a global media giant called Nisa Media. Although the new owner had laid off many people, Duke had stayed put. His mysterious boss, who no one knew about, had stubbornly kept him on. According to Joanna, Perry had deserved it many times over. In his last 5 months in Iraq, he had come back with a huge military scandal, bribery, and murder. But his success had not gone unpunished. Perry's daughter, who had received death threats, had been harassed by men who had been discharged from the military after reporting on her story. She had almost been raped but had been saved by university security guards. A week later, his wife had divorced him and moved in with their daughter in California. Perry had not been able to see either of them since. Joanna supposed that Perry, who occasionally disappeared from sight, had been watching them from afar. So the young woman decided to press the issue with a sigh. How was the news today? Joanna asked. It's third-page news, but something big could come out of nowhere, Perry said, eager to speak in a way Joanna hadn't expected. Normally, she would have simply commented, good, bad, average, and left the subject at that. So the young woman asked curiously, like what? The people who broke into the library weren't just kids or hackers. There could be big news behind this, Duke said, looking longingly at his finished cigarette and throwing the remaining filter into the small trash can. Joanna could tell Perry wasn't going to go into more detail, he was still a rookie. Duke had already talked too much to a rookie, but instead of bringing it up like that, he decided to change the subject and asked, how far is it to where we're going? But then she felt like she was at the same age she was when she sat in the back of the car and asked her mother, are we there yet? There's Carlos's, which is opening up in a Subway location on 56th Street, about a block away, Duke said, pointing in the direction they were heading. He meant one of the cold-serving sandwich shops that had franchises all over New York City. Why didn't we meet there? Joanna asked, nodding ahead. Something I learned from Humphrey Braden, Duke murmured with a smile,